Morning after my son's engagement dinner, I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes before I could bring myself to go inside. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard. I wasn't crying. I was past crying. I was doing that thing you do when something is cracked open inside you and you're trying to figure out whether you're broken or just changed. I decided I was changed. I called my lawyer at 8 the next morning. Her name is Frances, and she's been handling my affairs for going on 14 years. When I told her what I wanted to do, there was a pause on the line, a long one. "Phyllis," she said slowly, "are you absolutely certain?" I told her I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Let me go back. I'm 63 years old. I was born in Sudbury, Ontario, the second of 4 children. My father worked the nickel mines until his lungs gave out. My mother cleaned houses, not as a hobby, not as a side income, but as the thing that kept food on the table and the heat running through February. She worked for families in the better part of town, the part where the driveways were paved and the curtains were lined. She never once complained about it in front of us. But I watched her hands at dinner. I watched how they looked by the end of the week. I swore I would do something different, not better than her. She was the strongest woman I've ever known, but different, something that was mine. When I was 22, I married a kind man named Gordon. Gordon was a plumber. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, and we were happy in the way that young people are happy when they haven't yet learned what can be taken from them. My son was born the year after we married. We named him Andrew. Gordon died when Andrew was 9, an aneurysm, sudden and without warning, on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I came home from my shift at the hardware store and found him on the kitchen floor. The ambulance came. It didn't matter. I was 31 years old, a widow with a 9-year-old boy, a small semi-detached in Barrie, Ontario, and a savings account that would last us maybe 8 months if I was careful. I was careful. I worked the hardware store during the day and took bookkeeping courses at night through the community college. Andrew did his homework at the kitchen table while I did mine. We ate a lot of pasta. We watched hockey on Friday nights because the cable was cheaper than going anywhere. I told him his father would have loved watching him grow up, and that was the truest thing I ever said. When Andrew was 12, the house next door to us went up for sale. It had been a rental property, 3 units, and the owner was moving to British Columbia and wanted a quick sale. It was in rough shape. The listing price reflected that. I had saved enough for a down payment, just barely. Everyone I talked to told me it was a mistake. My sister said I was overextending myself. My mother-in-law said a woman alone shouldn't take on more than she could handle. My branch manager at the bank made me feel like I was asking him to fund a trip to the moon. I bought it anyway. I spent 2 years fixing it up slowly, mostly on weekends, with Andrew handing me tools and asking questions I did my best to answer. I learned things I never expected to learn: how to patch drywall, how to retile a bathroom floor, when to call a licensed contractor, and when you could do it yourself without burning down the building. I found I had a mind for it. Numbers and structures, what something was worth and what it could become. The rent from those 3 units covered the mortgage in 16 months. Then I bought another property. Then another. I never talked about it much. There was no reason to. It wasn't a secret exactly. Andrew knew we were comfortable, knew I owned properties, knew I worked hard, but I didn't sit him down and show him spreadsheets. I didn't introduce him to my tenants or take him to closings. I thought there was time for that. I thought there would come a moment when it was appropriate, when he was old enough and settled enough, and we'd sit down together and I'd explain how it all worked and what it would one day mean for him. I was waiting for the right moment. I waited too long. Andrew met Brittany 3 years ago at a work conference in Toronto. She is the daughter of Edward and Constance Whitmore. The Whitmores are old Hamilton money, the kind of family that has a lake house in Muskoka and refers to it simply as the cottage. as though there is only one cottage in the world, and naturally it belongs to them. Brittany is not a bad person. I want to be fair about that. She is polished and well-educated, and she clearly makes my son happy. But she grew up in a particular world, and that world had taught her certain things about certain kinds of people, things she held so naturally she probably didn't know she held them. I noticed it in small ways at first, the way she would glance at my hands when I arrived somewhere, the way she laughed a little too brightly when I mentioned a neighborhood she found unimpressive. She never said anything unkind directly. She was far too well raised for that. But there was a texture to her silences that I had learned to read. Her mother, Constance, was more direct. Constance Whitmore is the kind of woman who has never once in her life wondered whether she belongs in a room. She walks into spaces as though they were built for her. She has that particular talent, common among people who have never had to earn their confidence, of making you feel that your presence requires justification. The first time I met her, at a dinner Andrew arranged at a restaurant in Burlington, she asked me what I did. "Property management," I said. "Oh," she said, not meanly, just with a certain flatness, as though I'd told her I collected coupons. I didn't press it. There was no point. Some people have already decided what you are before you finish your sentence. More information just irritates them. The engagement dinner was held at the Whitmore family home in Ancaster. It's a beautiful house. I won't pretend otherwise. High ceilings, an English garden out the back, the kind of crown moulding that costs more per metre than most people spend on furniture. There were about 20 people there, the Whitmore's friends, a few of Andrew's colleagues, Constance's sister from Ottawa, who kept touching her pearls. I arrived with a bottle of Niagara Peninsula Cabernet Franc, a good one from a winery I liked, and a gift. The gift was the thing I'd worked on for 6 months. It was a recipe book, but calling it a recipe book feels like calling the CN Tower a building. It had started as a small project and grown into something I hadn't expected. I went through every recipe I'd made for Andrew growing up. The beef stew I made every January, the pierogies I'd learned from a Ukrainian neighbor in Barrie who had taken pity on a young widow and decided to feed her, the butter tarts I made every Christmas Eve without fail, the tomato soup from scratch that Andrew used to ask for whenever he was sick. I wrote them out by hand in a notebook, a proper one with a linen cover, and beside each recipe I wrote a memory. Not long, just a sentence or two. The first time I made the stew after Gordon died, and how Andrew had eaten 2 bowls and told me it tasted like Dad's favorite. The Christmas Eve my car wouldn't start, and we ate butter tarts for dinner and called it a feast. I also included recipes from my mother, her soda bread, her oatmeal squares, and from Gordon's mother, who had been a wonderful cook and who had passed years ago. I typed those ones up because her handwriting was difficult to read, but I printed them on aged paper so they'd look like what they were, something old and kept and passed forward. I had it spiral-bound at a print shop in town and put it in a gift bag with tissue paper. I almost bought a nicer box. I almost redid the cover. I told myself it was fine as it was, that it was enough. I should have trusted that feeling more than I did. We were about halfway through dinner when Brittany's cousin, a young woman who had been drinking steadily since before I arrived, started asking everyone to share their gifts. It wasn't planned, just one of those moments at a party where someone decides to make something happen. Most of the gifts were what you'd expect. Gift cards, monogrammed items, a weekend at a spa in Collingwood from the Whitmores themselves, presented in a heavy cream envelope. I handed my bag to Andrew and Brittany. Andrew opened it carefully, the way he always has. He's never been a ripper, even as a child. He pulled out the notebook and turned it over in his hands. "Mom," he said, and the way he said it made my chest do something complicated. Brittany opened the cover. She looked at the first page. Before she could say anything, Constance, who had leaned over to look, said it. "Oh, a recipe book." She said it lightly, pleasantly, with a little smile. Then she looked up at the table and said, "Isn't that adorable? A little homemade scrapbook." She said it to the room, not to me, as though I weren't there, as though I were furniture that had briefly become interesting. One of her friends laughed softly. The cousin who'd started the whole gift-sharing business said, "Oh, that's sweet." Brittany closed the cover gently and set it aside. She moved on to the next gift bag. Andrew said nothing. I sat there for a moment and felt something clarify inside me. Not anger exactly. Something colder and quieter than anger. The kind of feeling that comes when you've been patient for a very long time and you've just run out. I put my napkin on the table. I picked up my purse. I said quietly and clearly, "Congratulations to you both." I pushed in my chair. I walked to the front hall, retrieved my coat from the closet, and let myself out through the front door. No one came after me. I drove home to my house in Barry, the same one I'd bought with Gordon, the one I'd raised Andrew in, the one I'd kept through 30-odd years of everything. And I sat in the driveway for 11 minutes, watching the clock. Then I went inside and I made myself a cup of tea and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about what I owned. Here is what I own. Over the course of 31 years, working carefully and quietly and without anyone's help or permission, I had purchased 22 properties across Simcoe County and the Greater Barry area. Most of them were small rental units, a few single-family homes, one small commercial strip on Dunlop Street. I had managed all of them myself for the first 15 years before I hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day. I had paid off 11 of them outright. The estimated value of the portfolio, the last time Francis had put it together for me, was just over $4 million. The annual income, after expenses and management fees and taxes, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $240,000. I had never told Andrew the full picture. I had mentioned properties, vaguely, over the years. I don't think he understood the scale. I don't think Constance Whitmore had any idea that the woman she'd just invited to leave her dining room, politely, without words, with a small smile and a turned page, owned more real estate than her family had ever dreamed of managing. I thought about that for a while, sitting at the kitchen table with my tea going cold. Then I thought about the recipe book, sitting on a side table at that house in Ancaster, Andrew's grandmother's soda bread, Gordon's mother's oatmeal squares, 23 years of a life I'd built alone, written out by hand, set aside. I called Francis at 8 the next morning. Andrew called me 2 days later. He said he was sorry for what happened. He said it got out of hand. He said Constance could be a lot sometimes, and that Brittany hadn't meant anything by it. He asked me to understand. I told him I understood perfectly. He asked if I was coming to the engagement party they were planning for February. I said I wasn't sure yet. He said he loved me, and I said I loved him too, because that part was still true and always would be. But love is not the same as trust, and it is not the same as respect, and it is not the same as standing up in a room full of people and saying, "That is my mother, and you will not speak about her that way." He hadn't done that. I needed him to understand what that meant. Here is what I told Francis I wanted to do. For years, I had been loosely planning to leave the majority of my estate to Andrew. That had been the assumption, the quiet arrangement that had lived in my mind since before I'd even started thinking about it formally. He was my son. He was Gordon's son. He was the boy who had sat across from me at the kitchen table doing his homework while I did mine. Of course it was going to be Andrew. I told Francis I wanted to change the will, not to exclude Andrew entirely. I'm his mother, not a stranger, but to restructure it in a way that reflected something I believed in more deeply than I had realized until that night. I had grown up watching my mother work. I had watched her hands. I had known, without anyone ever saying it, what it meant to be the woman who cleaned the house rather than the woman who owned it. I had spent 30 years making sure that no one would ever look at me and see only that, not because I was ashamed of where I'd come from, never that, but because I had worked for something, and I wanted it to be seen. There was a women's shelter in Barry that I had been donating to quietly for years, small amounts, nothing dramatic. I knew the executive director slightly. We'd met at a community fundraiser years ago. The shelter ran transitional housing for women leaving difficult situations, mostly short-term, always overextended. I told Francis I wanted to set up a trust, a portion of the rental income, a meaningful portion, directed to the shelter in perpetuity, enough to fund 2 full transitional units on an ongoing basis. I also told Francis that the notebook, the one I'd left at that house in Ancaster, I wanted it back. She said that was an unusual request for an estate lawyer. I said I was aware. I called Andrew and asked him to bring me the recipe book. He didn't ask why. He drove up the following Saturday and set it on my kitchen table without ceremony. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. I should have said something, he said. He was looking at the table. Yes, I said, you should have. I didn't know what to say. I looked at my son, this 54-year-old man, this boy I had raised alone through snowstorms and grief and tight years, and I felt the same thing I always felt when I looked at him, love, full and without condition, but also something new, a kind of sorrow for what he had not yet learned. Andrew, I said, when someone calls your mother the help, you find the words. He didn't respond, but he heard me. I could see it. I did not go to the engagement party in February. I sent a card and a gift, a thoughtful one, from a kitchen shop in town, with a note that said I wished them both happiness and that I hoped they would build something good together. I meant every word. Constance apparently found this puzzling. She mentioned to someone, who mentioned to Andrew, who mentioned to me, that she found my absence strange, given how much work she had put into the event. I found that very interesting. Andrew came to see me twice more that spring. He was working things out, I think, growing into an understanding of something he had avoided for a long time. The third time he came, he brought Brittany. Brittany sat at my kitchen table and drank my tea and looked at the photographs on my refrigerator. She asked about one of them, Gordon and I, at Lake Huron, the summer before Andrew was born. He looks kind, she said. He was, I said. There was a long quiet. Then she said, Mrs. Mercer, I want to apologize for what happened at the dinner. I looked at her. I should have said something, she said. When my mother, she stopped, started again. It wasn't right. And I didn't say anything, and that wasn't right either. No, I agreed. It wasn't. I'm sorry. I poured her more tea. I did not tell her everything was fine because some things are not fine and should not be called fine, but I told her that I appreciated her saying so and that I hoped she meant it and that there was still time. She nodded. She held her mug with both hands. I got up and took the recipe book from the shelf where I put it. I set it in front of her. My mother's soda bread is on page 7, I said. The pierogies take about 2 hours, but they're worth it. She looked at me for a moment, and then she opened the cover. Francis finalized the trust in April. 2 residential units at the shelter, funded in perpetuity from the rental income. The director called me when the paperwork came through. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Phyllis, do you know how many women this is going to help? I told her I had some idea. I haven't changed the rest of the will. Andrew is still in it. The properties will still largely be his, one day. The ones I haven't already designated elsewhere. He is still my son. He is still Gordon's son. I am not interested in punishment. But I wanted him to understand something before that day came. I wanted him to know, clearly and without ambiguity, what I had built and what it stood for. Not as a threat, as a fact. He knows now. Last December, Andrew and I went to the shelter's annual fundraising dinner together. He didn't ask why I was involved. He just came. He wore the tie Gordon had given him years ago, a nice one, dark green, that I'd held onto after Gordon died and passed along to Andrew when he graduated. He didn't know I recognized it, but I did. We sat together at a table near the front. The director spoke about the new units coming online. She didn't mention my name. I had asked her not to. Afterward, Andrew drove me home. We sat in the driveway for a moment before I got out, just the way I had sat alone that night in November, watching the clock. "Mum," he said. "Yes." "I'm proud of you." I looked at him, this boy who hadn't known what to say when it mattered, this man who was learning. "I know," I said, "and I'm proud of you too, for being here." I got out of the car and walked up the front path to the house Gordon and I had bought together, the one I had kept through everything, the one that had started all of it. The porch light was on. It's always on when I come home. I got into that habit years ago when Andrew was little and came home after dark, and I never stopped. Some habits are worth keeping. I went inside, put on the kettle, and got out the recipe book. I made my mother's soda bread. I keep thinking about my mother's hands. She never complained about them, but I noticed the way children notice things they're not supposed to notice, the cracks across her knuckles in February, the way she pressed them flat against her thighs when she sat down, like she was trying to hide what the work had done to her. She cleaned other people's houses so that ours would have heat, and she did it without apology, without performance, and without ever asking to be seen. I think about her a lot when I think about that dinner in Ancaster, about Constance's little smile, about the way she said the help lightly, almost warmly, the way people say things when they've never once considered that the person they're saying it about might have a different kind of life than the one they've assigned them. What I've come to understand is that the cruelty wasn't really in the words, it was in the certainty, the absolute, unexamined certainty that she already knew what I was worth, that she could look at me across a dinner table, look at my gift, at my hands, at wherever I'd come from, and that would be enough information. Case closed, woman assessed. That kind of certainty doesn't come from intelligence. It comes from never having been wrong about something that mattered. I spent 31 years being wrong, making adjustments, and trying again. That's how you build anything real. You start with what you have, which is rarely enough, and you figure out the next right thing. You buy a broken-down triplex nobody else wants. You learn to patch drywall on a Saturday afternoon with a 9-year-old handing you tools. You make mistakes that cost you money and time, and you sit with the consequences, and you do better. None of it is glamorous. None of it is the kind of thing you announce at dinner parties. But it accumulates. It compounds. It becomes something. What I want, when I think about what I hope Andrew takes from all of this, is not that he understands what I own. I want him to understand how I came to own it, the discipline of it, the steadiness, the refusal to spend more than I had, and the willingness to be uncomfortable for years so that something better could happen later. That's not a financial lesson. That's a way of moving through the world. It's what my mother had, even if she never called it anything. And the other piece, the harder piece, is the matter of knowing what's right and doing it anyway, even when the room is full of people who will find it awkward. Andrew didn't find the words that night, but he's finding them now, slowly, in the way people do when they finally understand what was at stake. I'm watching him get there. That matters to me more than any of it. The trust Francis set up will outlast me. 2 units, ongoing, for women who need somewhere solid to land while they're putting themselves back together. My mother would not have used that shelter. She was never in that situation, but she would have understood it. She would have understood the particular exhaustion of building a life with your own hands, while the world decides, without asking, what you must be worth. I made this soda bread last week. It came out right. The kitchen smelled the way it did when I was small, and I stood at the counter and let myself feel that for a while. Some things you carry forward, some things you build from scratch. The ones worth keeping you know by how they feel when they're done.